The black ship did not arrive with a message, or demand, or warning. It simply appeared in Earth's orbit like a silence that absorbed every signal, ignored every language, and dismissed every frequency with an indifference so total it felt like the planet was being weighed and quietly found a relevant captain. Elias Wren had commanded Earth's first interplanetary fleet during the Europa blockade. He had diffused a mutiny with a 6-line ultimatum, and once negotiated a ceasefire between 3 colonial factions with nothing more than a printed map and a field chair. He believed in precision over threat and found comfort in cold reasoning. He now stood in the temporary orbital command deck built inside UNESC's crisis station, circling below the black ship. His voice calm as he instructed a tactical pause on further signal attempts, and when an aide asked why, he simply said that if an entity does not answer, it is not because it does not far below on the ground, inside a weather-beaten house. In northern Canada, a child named Aidan Price was sitting in a living room, thick with old books and thin rugs. The kind of room that never had visitors, but always had presence. Aidan was 6, unnervingly quiet, mildly echolalic, and only recently moved from a failed neurodevelopmental program that had labeled him socially underreactive, but internally divergent. His mother said he often drew spirals and figures that looked like ancient calligraphy, and once told her the moon made too much noise. No one believed him until the deep field receiver near his village blinked, with a signal that matched nothing known, but echoed in the exact rhythm of his brain. Scandinavian analysts had tried standard transmission codes from the very first day of the ship's arrival, rotating through mathematical prime pulses, harmonic culture tones, and deep encoded diplomatic hails from the Mars Accords. The ship remained dark to it all, but the moment Aidan was brought into the observation chamber and allowed to simply sit in front of a passive receiver while holding a drawing pencil, the ship extended a thread of narrowband radiation that flickered only once, and in that flicker copied the shape he had drawn. An impossible triangle that curved in all 3 dimensions at one seethe. Signal was precise, not a broadcast, but a deliberate one-to-one transfer addressed to a child with no official role and no strategic profile. It triggered a formal doctrine debate within UNESC's internal council, where half the room believed it to be a data trap, and the other half whispered that perhaps contact could only be established where hierarchy did not exist. It was Elias Wren who broke the debate by standing and stating flatly that if the ship had selected its point of contact, then the only intelligent response was to listen through that point. Met Aidan the next day in a quiet hangar surrounded by layered shielding and multi-tiered security personnel. The boy looked at him only once, and returned to folding the edges of a square paper into a spiral that held perfect symmetry even in motion. Wren watched silently, and then said, "I do not understand why they chose you, but I have commanded too many battles to ignore a selection this exact. If you can speak to them, or even hear them, I will make sure no one gets in your way." Aidan did not answer with words, but walked toward the transmission platform and placed his drawing under the receiver plate. 3 seconds later, the black ship released a low harmonic tone that sent ripples through the magnetic field of the station, not violent, but purposeful. And for the first time since its arrival, it adjusted its position in orbit by precisely 200 meters closer to Earth, and then stopped again, as if waiting for something only the boy could understand. Captain Elias Wren stood before the assembled multinational delegation, a cluster of the most tightly guarded minds on the planet, each one accustomed to authority, strategy, and controlled exposure to the unknown. He did not raise his voice, because he never needed to, and when he said the ship has initiated its first response protocol, not toward us, not toward our systems, but directly in line with the boy's coordinates, the silence in the chamber was not from disbelief, but from the unmistakable shift in priority that came when something completely outside procedure started. Defining its own black ship extended a single structure from its hull, not a weapon. or a bridge or a standard docking probe, but a corridor made of matte material that reflected no light and dissolved every scanning pulse fired at it. Its trajectory aimed not at UNESC's flagship or any major installation, but instead at the neutral observation station in orbit. As if it had no interest in diplomacy or defense, but in creating a controlled space, a test perhaps, or a corridor for something more than just passage aeronaut xenolinguist Dr. Nasira Kalam, who had spent 2 decades studying fragmentary syntax. From pre-contact ruins across 3 moons, examined the shape and alignment of the corridor's edges, and remarked, not to impress, but as an observation grounded in expertise, that it mirrored ancient navigational glyphs used by civilizations that did not differentiate between thought and movement. When she asked Aidan if he recognized any part of it, the child looked up from his drawing pad and said quietly, "It's a question that hasn't decided what to ask yet. The decision to enter the corridor was not taken lightly. Several military advisors argued that it was a containment trap designed to measure human vulnerability. Others proposed sending autonomous drones or high-precision spectra drones outfitted with qubit-level recorders. Elias Wren overrode them all and announced he would enter personally, and when pressed for justification, he said, "We've built our command principles on initiative and risk for centuries. If we abandon those now, we'll answer a question we were never allowed to hear inside the corridor." No light source was visible, but every surface glowed faintly. In a way that responded to movement and proximity, it was not mechanical, but perceptive. There were no life forms, no readable heat signatures. But as Wren walked further, the walls projected symbols, then star systems, and finally holographic tableau of planets rendered in perfect silence, each one followed by a single visual: desolation, not from battle or collapse, but from erasure. So total, it felt like a surgical decision had been executed at cosmic scala. The ship identified itself as Calrec Da, not a proper name, but a class designation within what it called the Volare Congruence, an interstellar network of observers and adjudicators, whose purpose was not conquest or alliance, but cataloging and classification. They intervened only when a species triggered what they called non-linear thresholds, moments when unpredictability and intellectual recursion aligned to signal the presence of dangerous potential. Humanity had not triggered these thresholds despite its wars, machines, or transmission sext for Aidan, whose neural patterns during an unscripted sketch matched a fractal sequence embedded in a Volare transmission code lost 3,000 cycles ago, a code designed to activate only upon recognition by a mind not trained to see it. A child who should not have been capable of interpretation had answered without knowing, and that made the Volare pause all further protocols because they had not predicted it, and because prediction was the only thing they trusted as proof of order. While diplomats and strategists in Geneva debated the implications of the Volare's attention, a quiet but deliberate breach was unfolding in the outer rings of Mars. The Martian Confederacy, never fully aligned with Earth's unified command structure, had grown increasingly suspicious of UNESC's cautious stance. Their defense minister authorized a covert strike operation without council approval, a maneuver executed by cloaked interceptor drones equipped with quantum field disruptors. The mission directive was simple: deliver a sharp, irreversible signal to demonstrate that humanity would not kneel to an uninvited, orbiting judge. The attack struck with flawless precision, threading through the BlackShip's gravitational null zones and emitting a 3-tiered logic bomb directly into its outer field array. But instead of explosion or retaliation, the ship simply shifted, its hull vibrating across wavelengths previously unrecorded, and within minutes, a global phenomenon began. Every orbital satellite lost function. Every deep space probe went silent. Every communication node tied to Earth's upper atmosphere shut down as if the world had been placed inside a silent dome of stasis. No physical damage was visible. No networks were fried or destroyed, but power could not be transmitted beyond. Low orbit and feedback loops returned only encoded data strings structured in prime, intervals that looped endlessly without meaning. For 3 days, the planet operated blind in the upper layers of its own infrastructure, reduced to ocean cables and localized transmissions. And it was only when UNESC declared a temporary suspension of offensive capabilities that the grid restored itself in a single synchronized pulse. The message was unambiguous. The Volari had the ability to isolate an entire species without striking a single surface. They did not respond to the Martian attack with force, because they did not require it. Instead, they responded with removal, a clean demonstration that their silence was not weakness, but restraint, and that such restraint had limits defined by observation, not morality, Captain. Elias Wren addressed the Volari interface within the Kalrekda, directly using the formal protocol, a strategic apology, a human diplomatic measure reserved for catastrophic missteps that acknowledge fault without surrender of self-determination. He stated that the act of aggression was not sanctioned by the collective voice of humanity and did not reflect the intentions or principles of the species as a whole. Aiden was once again placed in proximity to the ship's transmission array under strict biometric containment, and when asked to speak, he said calmly, "We are still learning how to agree with ourselves. But we do not stop learning when we disagree after that." The Volari fell silent for 7 solar cycles, a span known in their lexicon as evaluative inertia, a state in which observational protocol overrides judgment until all variables are reclassified. And when they returned, it was not with threat or closure, but with the first offer of dialogue. The Kalrekda transmitted a single line of conditional engagement to UNESC, an invitation to enter the first tier of Volari contact governance, known as observational admission. It was not an alliance, nor an approval, but a chance to submit to measured evaluation under structured metrics. In exchange, Earth would retain limited technological autonomy and the right to nominate delegates for interspecies engagement, but there was a cost. Humanity had to unify its global command and speak with one operational voice, and failure to do so would result in indefinite classification under passive quarantine, where the Volari would never again respond, engage, or return. The vote to unify Earth's global command was held under emergency protocols across multiple continental alliances, bypassing traditional legislative pathways and triggering the most coordinated political action in recorded history. Within 20 hours, major blocs including the European sphere, the Pan-African Coalition, the North American Alliance, and the Sino-Eurasian Accord had secured conditional agreements. The only outlier was the Martian Confederacy, whose representatives refused to recognize terrestrial authority and broadcast a formal denouncement of UNESC's negotiations with what they called a non-sentient enforcement mechanism. Captain Elias Wren, tasked with forming the human delegation to board the Kalrekda, submitted a list of candidates comprised not only of military tacticians and scientific advisors, but also philosophical historians, pattern theorists, and one neurolinguistic child under protected status, Aiden Price. His presence on the delegation was contested by multiple agencies, citing risk, unpredictability, and symbolic imbalance. But Elias responded with a direct statement to the assembly, saying if we are being judged on our patterns, then the child who broke theirs is the most strategic mind we have. Aiden agreed to join the crew on one condition. He asked that his mother be allowed to accompany him, not as a delegate, not as a scientist, but simply as herself. The request was not protocol, but was granted, not out of sentiment, but out of caution, because none of the psychological modeling teams had successfully predicted the child's preferences or decisions, and by then, they had learned that what they could not predict, they could not afford to ignore. The delegation entered the ship through the previously established corridor, now transformed into a corridor of fluid geometry, its shape adapting to the neurological frequencies of those who passed through it. Inside the Kalrekda, Space obeyed different constraints. Rooms existed only when occupied. Light responded. To attention, and information was not displayed but evoked. The Volari did not present themselves in any form. Instead, they used abstract communication structures, woven from mathematical concepts and cultural references extrapolated from the sum of humanity's digital archives. But it was not these advanced systems that unsettled the delegation. It was the ship's tendency to observe not just their words or decisions, but their silence, their hesitations, their internal logic spirals during moments of uncertainty. Aidan, in particular, seemed to synchronize with the ship's interface naturally, often sketching shapes in the air that the ship would then replicate as projections in the surrounding space. And during one session, he altered a three-dimensional fractal algorithm by instinct, which in turn caused the ship to shift course without warning toward a different region of Specieth's course correction brought them to a structure unknown to all human star charts. A cluster of orbiting rings rotating in prime number intervals, emitting signals no human system could decode. Elias ordered a full scan and requested a formal explanation from the ship. The Calric Da responded with a sequence of visual data, frames showing multiple species extinct, erased, or withdrawn, followed by a line of text that simply read, "These are the ones who chose performance over patience within days." Polari protocols began to shift. Observation layers were opened, temporal. Access filters lifted, and the crew was granted insight into the Volari's internal evaluative logic. The Calric Da began learning in return, adjusting its own subroutines in response to Aidan's unscripted interactions. And when Elias observed that the ship's predictive engine had begun forming questions instead of answers, he understood what no system had yet concluded: the Volari had not come to decide humanity's future. They had come to verify whether humanity still had one they had not anticipated. Within the outer shell of Calric Da, deep in the encrypted layers of its observational matrix, a rupture was detected, an unauthorized access code embedded with a directive sequence from a faction within the Volari congruence itself. Identifying as Zavek, the sequence initiated a protocol known in Volari jurisprudence as a simulated incursion. Not an attack, but a manufactured conflict constructed to provoke and assess a species' response under perceived existential threat. Simulation began with a series of artificial energy spikes radiating from false coordinates near Earth's orbital perimeter, followed by the appearance of synthetic signatures resembling an unknown fleet approaching from interstellar void space. Global defense systems, recently reactivated post-unification, picked up the data and immediately classified it as high priority. Hostile emergence. UNESC's council was split between two responses: confront or contain. But Captain Elias Wren, now elevated to full planetary strategic oversight, had already calculated the improbability matrix and concluded it was a designed manipulation, not by humanity's enemies, but by its evaluators. He ordered a complete planetary blackout of all satellite communications, orbital defense relays, and long-range surveillance systems, not as surrender but as denial, refusing to play the simulation, refusing to offer reaction, refusing to provide data for 17 hours. The planet sat in strategic silence, the sky filled with false patterns and synthetic echoes, yet no action was taken. And when the Zavek stream attempted to escalate the scenario by transmitting weaponized propaganda scripts into digital networks, they found no receivers open, no circuits alive, no audience present, and the simulation collapsed under the weight of its own unrewarded complexitithous move, sent a shock through the Volari hierarchy. The Zavek had believed that a species so recently introduced to galactic attention would react impulsively, violently, or at minimum with curiosity. But humanity had offered none of these. Instead, it had responded with strategic nullification, an act of restraint so deliberate it forced the Volari to revise the very parameters by which they defined intelligence. Riadianus, in a subsequent conclave, The High Observance of the Volari issued a formal reclassification of Earth's profile status, upgrading it from passive volatile to node candidate, a term reserved for emerging civilizations capable of long-term convergence without ideological fracturing. It was not an invitation into the core structure of the Volari congruence, but it was a clear pathway. A beginning Kalek Da adjusted its route and signaled a final message to the UNESCO delegation aboard. This transmission was encoded in temporal logic form and interpreted jointly by Dr. Nasira Kalim, Captain Elias Wren, and Aiden Price. The message stated that humanity had not only passed initial evaluation, but had altered the evaluation system itself, creating variables the Volari had not accounted for in over 1,000 recorded cyclosarth would retain. Autonomy, but now existed within a tiered framework of galactic observation, with access to limited knowledge streams, the right to send representatives to outer diplomatic synods, and the responsibility of maintaining internal coherence without artificial augmentations. The Kalrik Da prepared to depart for deeper void sectors, leaving behind 2 observation beacons in Earth's upper orbit. Eden asked if he would see them again, and the ship responded not with words, but with a vision of a future skyline etched with unfamiliar stars and a sky where ships moved not as invaders or judges, but as neighbors. In its final data stream, the Volari amended Earth's profile, appending a single line beneath its species entry, a quiet declaration that carried the weight of something more than curiosity, something like respect humanity, unpredictably recursive, structurally divergent, potential undetermined.